So for the group, this is a checking of our understanding on power fluctuation. So group A, group B, and group C. I believe someone is representing you. So let's get into these questions and answer it briefly. So group A, it says interference from generators and lightning is called what? Interference from generators and lightning. Group A. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, for listening.
Yes, sir.
So
I
let's
don't know
get.
if group A is available.
Group A is not available. Nobody from group A. Okay. What about group B?
Felix AD should be in group A. I don't know. Felix is in group A. Felix is group A.
Felix, you are in group A. You are the only group A.
All right.
So what's the answer? Interference from generators and lightning. We talked about it. Is it spike? Is it surge protector? Is it noise? Is it blackout? Is it standby power?
I think it's noise.
You say what?
Noise.
Final answer?
Noise.
Okay. Let's see. Correct?
Okay.
Correct. All right, it's noise. All right, let's move to the second one. Group B. Sudden increase in voltage exceeding 100% of the normal voltage on a line is called what?
Spike.
Final answer?
Yes.
Correct. Dramatic increase in voltage above the normal flow of electricity or electrical current is called what? Group C.
Power surge.
Power surge. Final answer?
Yes, power surge.
Correct. Group A. Supplies a consistent level of electrical power to a computer or other device is called what? Group A. No answer?
Oh, my mic is mute. I'm asking you, please.
What's the answer?
I say UPS, UPS.
Final answer?
Yes.
All right, correct. Group B, provide a backup battery to supply power when the incoming voltage drops below the normal level. Provides a backup battery to supply power when the incoming voltage drops below the normal level. It's called
Standby.
what?
SPS.
Final answer?
Yes.
Correct. All right. So we have the understanding of the power fluctuation term. So we're moving to the next right now. So we're through with the power. So if you have any question concerning power, please ask before we move into the CPU architecture and operation. Now we want to see how the particular CPU is being designed. Okay, we know CPU is the central processing unit. So this diagram you'll see is called CPU, which I think we talked about in chapter 1. So we want to now identify the architecture of the CPU. So if you have any question on the power before I proceed, I just want to believe if you don't have any question, that means you understand, the power supply we just went through now. So if you have any question, just for 2 minutes, please ask before I proceed. All right, no question. So we'll proceed. All right. So we're talking about the CPU architectures. A program is a sequence of stored instructions. A program is a sequence of stored instructions. Now, a CPU executes these instructions by following a specific instruction set. A CPU executes these instructions by following a specific instruction set. So we're going to look at some of the two types of instruction sets that CPU may use. The first one is the reduced instruction set computer called RISC, while the second one is the complex instruction set computer, which is the CISC. Now, every CPU has an architecture, and that's what we want to talk about right now. So let's look at the set of instructions that they have. The first one, which is the reduced instruction set computer, RISC, has architecture that uses a relatively small set of instructions. RISC chips are designed to execute this instruction very rapidly. Some well-known CPUs using RISC are PowerPC and ARM. Okay? Then we have the complex instruction set computer. This architecture uses a broad set of instructions, resulting in a fewer steps per operation. Intel x86 and Motorola 68K are some well-known CPUs using CISC. Now, which one are we conversant with? We are conversant with the Intel x86. Motorola 68K, most of them are used on the servers. PowerPCs and ARM, but the Intel x86. So most times when you look at the setup of your computer, you always see Intel x86 appearing on the information on your system. All right. So those are the major ones that actually we use. So while the CPU is executing one step of the program, the remaining instructions and the data are stored nearby in a special high-speed memory called cache. So for every instruction that goes around your computer system, there is a memory called cache. All right, so let's move on to see the operation. They're using an example, they're using an highway example for you. So let's follow up and understand the enhancing CPU operation. How does it operate? Various CPU manufacturers complement their CPU with performance enhancing features. For instance, Intel in their listing, Intel incorporates what we call hyperthreading. Okay, hyperthreading is to enhance the performance, of some of their CPUs. With hyperthreading, multiple pieces of code are executed simultaneously in the CPU. So to an operating system, a single CPU with hyperthreading performs as though there are two CPUs when multiple trends are being processed. That's for the Intel. Then for the AMD processors, they use what we call hypertransport to enhance their CPU performance. Hypertransport is a high-speed connection between the CPU and the NOT bridge chip. Now, the discussion here, before I go further, is to understand the whole idea of what we have a Pentium. Why do we have a Pentium with a 3.5 gigahertz? Why do we have iCore with 4.4 gigahertz? Why do we have iCore 5, iCore 3, iCore 7? This is the architecture and the design of their operation. That's what they are discussing right now. So the power of a CPU is measured by the speed and the amount of data that it can process per time. So the speed of a CPU is rated in cycles per second, such as millions of cycles per second, called megahertz. That is where the word megahertz comes from. Is an operation that takes place. Okay? Is an operation that takes place in the CPU, the process of data called megahertz, or billions of cycles per second called gigahertz. So the amount of data that a CPU can process at one time depends on the size of the front side bus, which is called an FSB. So this is also called the CPU bus or the processor data bus. Okay, so high performance can be achieved when the width of the FSB increases. So most times when you are buying a computer, you hear 64 bits, you hear 34 bits. Okay, so much like a roadway, so then I'll give an example. Much like a roadway can carry more cars. I explained this, I used the bus the other day, I was talking about it. Much like a roadway can carry more cars when it has many lanes. Okay, the width of the FSB is measured in bits. So a bit is the smallest unit of data in a computer. So current processors, the current processors we use today, use a 32-bit or a 64-bit FSB. So when your computer is actually coming up and you are being asked, what is the bit of your computer? They want to know the speed, the FSB of your processor. So we have the 64-bit and we have the 32-bit. So let's move on. So there's what we call overclocking. Okay, and it's very important you understand this overclocking. A lot of people want to buy a system with a lower processor and they want to overclock it to the higher speed. You can do that, but there's always some challenges that comes. So let's look at the overclocking techniques. Overclocking is a technique used to make a processor work at a faster speed than its original specification. So Overclocking is not a recommended way to improve computer performance and can result in damage to the CPU. So we always tell most people that want to tell a client that I'm giving you an iCore 5, and your iCore 5 will come with a 5.0 or a 4.0 speed, you know. So what they do, they buy a 3.0 and go and overclock it to a 5.0. So the system can be very fast. So what you're saying is it is very wrong to do that. So the opposite of a overclocking is CPU throttling. Now, CPU throttling is a technique used when the processor runs at less than the rated speed to conserve power or produce less heat. So what you're saying is you don't need to use the throttling techniques or use the overclocking technique. Just leave the system the way it is. Throttling is commonly used on laptops and other mobile devices, slowing down, you know, the speed of the system so it doesn't overheat or it doesn't take much, you know, heat. Try to reduce the power conservation, and so a lot of them configure it that way. So the system says, or the technology says, it is not good. It could damage the CPU of the system. So let's look at the CPU virtualization. Okay, so CPU virtualization is a hardware feature supported by AMD and Intel CPUs that enables a single processor to act as multiple processors. Now, it is very important as an engineer, when you're buying a computer system, you're buying your system from a vendor, make sure you check the setup of your computer, especially when you are not the one assembling it. You just want to buy a system. You want to buy a ready-made system, and you go to Computer Village. They're telling you the system is iCore 7 and 4.0 speed, you know, 8 gig. It is better you go into your setup, which is the BIOS setup, to check the settings of all what you're buying, because most times they use all the CPU virtualizations. Okay, so let's look at what we have now. Is a hardware feature supported by AMD and Intel CPUs that enables a single processor to act as a multiple processor. This hardware visualization technology allows the operating system to support visualization more effectively and efficiently than is possible through software emulations. So with CPU visualization, multiple operating systems can run in parallel on their own virtual machine as if they were running on completely independent computers. CPU visualization is sometimes disabled by default. In what? In the BIOS, and will need to be enabled. So most times for me, I always, if you don't have a machine that can do this job, you don't get on it. Now, for some of you that were using a system and your system was slacking, it was not moving well because we are using a visualization, that means you need to go to the setup of your desktop. Like Mr. Dixon was trying to do a visualization, we have to do a simulation of packet tracer. You can go to your BIOS setup and enable your visualization settings. So you can be able to, your processor can be able to actualize the process of your packet tracer. That's if the system you are using could not carry, you know, the job of the packet tracer. So you can go through this means to set it. That's what they're trying to say here. So you can actually do that on your own. So we want to talk about the multi-core processors. So now look at the diagram. Can you see the diagram clearly? Can you see the diagram clearly? All right. So we want to talk about the multi-core processors. The multi-core processors, that's the dual core, triple core, quad core, hexa core, octa core. So we want to talk about it. So The latest processor technology has resulted in the CPU manufacturers finding ways to incorporate more than one CPU core into a single chip. So a multi-core processor has 2 or more processors on the same integrated circuit. In some architectures, the cores have separated L2 and L3 cache resources. So while in other architecture, cache is shared among the different cores for better performance and resources allocation. So the table in the figure describes the various types of multi-cores. So we're going to look into that table as we finish this. So it says integrating the processor on the same chip creates a very fast connection between them. That's one. So a multi-core processor executes instruction more quickly than a single core processor. Instruction can be distributed to all the processors at the same time. So a RAM is shared between the processors because the cores reside on the same chip. So a multi-core processor is recommended for applications such as video editing, gaming, and photo manipulations. Okay, so high power consumption creates more heat in the computer system. Sorry, in the computer case. So a multi-core processor conserves power and produce less heat than multiple single core processor, thus increasing performance and efficiency. So let's look at the number of cores and the descriptions. So on our left-hand side, we see the single core CPU. What does it do? One core inside a single CPU that handles all the processing. A motherboard may have sockets for more than one single processor, providing the ability to build a powerful multi-processor computer. Then we have what we call a dual-core CPU. 2 cores inside a single CPU, in which both cores can process information at the same time. Then we have the triple-core CPU. 3 cores inside a CPU, a single CPU, okay? This is a quad-core processor with one of the cores disabled. That means the quad-core, but a disabled one. Then we have the quad-core itself, CPU, which is 4 cores in one single CPU. Then we have the hexa-core CPU, which is 6 cores inside a single CPU, and we have the octa-core. Now, all these iCore 7, iCore 3, iCore 5, okay, has all these multi-processor cores or multi-core processors. All right. So that is why the speed you get from an iCore, or the speed you get from an iCore 7 is different from the speed you get from an iCore 5 or an iCore 3. All right. So many of them comes with, I've not seen the octa-core for now, but the iCore 7 is still the latest core we have for now. All right. Okay. Why the hexa-core is actually iCore 7. The quad-core is iCore 5. Why the triple-core is iCore 3. Then the dual-core, which everybody knows. All right. So this is how. But the octa-core, I don't think that machine has been. I know I've heard AMD has actually produced such machines, but for the Intel, from the record, I've not seen yet. I'm still on the iCore 7 technology. All right. So another feature found in some CPUs is an integrated graphics processing unit called GPU. Some CPUs come with a graphic processor unit. So what is this graphic processor unit? The GPU is a chip, okay? Is a chip that performs the rapid mathematical calculation required to render graphics. A GPU can be integrated or dedicated, okay? Integrated GPUs are often directly embedded on the CPU and is dependent on the system RAM, while the dedicated GPU is a separate chip with its own video memory. All right. So most times you find out that when you are buying your CPU, you need to look at the manual, okay? Because you might not see the chip, but you need to look at the manual to read about the manual of your CPU you are buying to see the functionality of what your CPU can actually do. But for me, I tell anyone buying any computer today must buy a computer that carries a GPU, because we all know what streaming on the videos, shooting of videos, almost everybody edits video now because of the content you want to create and put on your social media. So it is very important. So a GPU is a separate chip with its own video memory dedicated exclusively for graphical processing. So the benefit of integrated GPU is cost and less heat dissipation. So this allows for cheaper computers and smaller form factors to come on board. The trade-off is performance, okay? The trade-off is actually performance. Integrated CPUs are good at less complex tasks, like watching videos and processing graphical documents, but are not best suited for intense gaming application. All right. So CPUs, now we're talking about CPU now. CPUs have also been enhanced using what we call the NX bit. So the NX bit is the latest technology that you find. Just the way you have your 32-bit, you have your 64-bit, then now we have what we call an NX bit, okay? Also called the execute disable bit. This feature, when supported and enabled in the operating system, can protect areas of memory that contain operating system files from malicious attacks by malwares. So technology is actually growing rapidly. So multi-core processors are the latest processors you buy in the market today. Okay, so if you're doing anything or you're trying to assemble computer for a client, the best thing is to actually go straight a multi-core, you know.
Question, please.
All right, we're taking questions now.
Yeah, in the descriptions, we have octa-core, hexa-core, and quad-core. Then we have triple-core. And in triple-core, one of the processors, they said is disabled. Why that? What's the reason for disabling one of the processors?
Now, why they disable one of the processors is because the manufacturers actually manufactured it into a quad core. All right. So when they manufactured it to the quad core, the technology of quad core was not there yet. But what they did was, since everyone wants to go into the triple core CPU at that time, they had to disable one. Okay, so that is how they made it. It's like you making something and you know that the functions of the RAM, because for every CPU you make it for the functions of the RAM as well. If the RAM is too, if the CPU core is higher than the RAM available, the system will not work. So at that period, the triple core was what is in vain, what was available. All right, and that triple core was produced with a quad core technology. So they had to disable the one of the quad core to enable the available RAM work with the system. So at that time, there was a particular level of RAM that was available. RAM was not beyond 16-bit. 16 gigabytes RAM was the highest. You understand? And for you to have a quad core requires more bits, okay, to function. I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. So can the triple core be upgraded again to quad core?
Yes, it can be upgraded. Now, that's why they are bringing it every year. This is their own market. When they came out, it's not like they came out with 4 or 5 of them at once. No. This is the stage we had today. We are in the octa core. By next year now, they might be producing the other one. They might produce a new one. So all this single core generation came. After 2 years later, dual core generation came. After another 2 years, triple core generation came. After another 3 years, quad core generation came. After, something like that. So we now have all these CPUs available from their production. So at that time, they were producing the triple core. They already had a plan to produce the quad core, but at that stage, there was no organization that was producing a RAM that was higher to work for a quad core. So from those production, you have to disable it. So from their own default setting, when they were producing it, they disabled one of the cores. That's why they made us understand. So when you are buying a triple core, if you buy an i3 core, your i3 core can, sorry, core i3, it can actually do the work of a quad core.
Oh, really?
Yes, they are very close. That's
Okay.
how the processor was produced at that time.
It's okay. Thank you.
All right. So integrating the processors on the same. Okay, I'm actually beyond that. So I'm talking about the features now. Another features found in the CPU is an integrated. Okay, we've talked about this. So we're moving to the next. Sorry, I think we're in the CPU cooling maintenance mechanism. Sorry. So how do you, with this architecture we've seen, how do you cool the heat that comes from these processors? Okay, so we want to look at different types. You can see a diagram. Okay, CPU cooling mechanisms is what we want to look at now. So we're going to look at the case fan first, which is the one we've talked about before. Case fan increasing the airflow in the computer case allows more heat to be removed. An active cooling solution uses fans inside of a computer case to blow out hot air. For increased airflow, some cases have multiple fans with cool air being brought in while another fan is blowing out hot air. See, we talked about the casing the other time. So we're coming back into some of the techniques, all right? The mechanism of cooling a CPU. First is a case. You must have a case that has a fan. Very, very important. I mentioned it the last time we were talking about case in the chapter 1. Your case must have a fan. So when you are buying, these are the things you see. These are the specifications you see before you buy your case. Okay, you must make sure there are fans available, that can take out air, and you can see a lot of space. Like the case you're looking here now, there's a net at the back that can release air. Okay, create more air ventilations for the machines. Then we have the heat sink that has absorbed the heat. So the CPU generates a lot of heat inside the case. Okay, so draw heat away from the CPU core. A heat sink is installed on top of it. Okay, so the heat sink has a large surface area with a metal fins to dissipate heat into the surrounding air. So this is known as passive cooling. Between the heat sink and the CPU is a special thermal compound, which we saw in the diagram in chapter 1 or chapter 2. The thermal compound increases the efficiency of heat transfer from the CPU to heat sink by filling any tiny gaps between the two. So this heat sink absorbs the heat on the CPU. CPU is always very hot. If you power a CPU without a fan on it and you touch it, when we're doing the practical, we're going to see it. We're going to see what I'm talking about. It's always very hot. Can even burn your thumb or burn your finger. But with the heat sink, all right, it will absorb the heat gradually while the air within the case can actually be blowing the insect to cool the CPU. So that's how the technology is. So let's look at another function. So you can say there's what we call the CPU fan. Apart from you having the in-sync, they still have a fan, okay, on it. So CPUs that are overclocked or running multiple cores tend to generate excessive heat. It's a very common practice to install a fan on top of the heatsink. So you already have heatsink already, then you now put a fan on the heatsink. The fan moves heat away from the metal fins of the heatsink. This is known as the active cooling. So we have a passive cooling, we have the active cooling. Please take note of that. During your exam, it comes out. Then we have the graphic card cooling system. This is the graphic card. So you already know where the graphic card is being plugged. Can somebody tell me where the graphic card is being plugged? Where do we plug the graphic cards? I'm going to call someone. If you don't, if somebody's not answering, where do we plug the graphic cards? We did this in chapter 2.
I think maybe it's PZ something.
You said what?
PZ system, sir.
You said I didn't get that.
PZ system.
I don't know. I can't hear that clearly. I know you said something about P, then there's a Z something. I'm confused. Do you mean PCI Express?
I'll be something like that.
PCI, you must know it too. It's not something, no. It's not PCZ something. You must know it. You are a technician now.
Yes.
It's called PCI Express. Okay, that's where we plug it. All right, let's move on. All right, so we have other components are also susceptible to heat damage and are often equipped with fans. So video adapter cards have their own processors too, because they generate heat. Okay, so they are called graphic process unit, which generates excessive heat as well. Video adapter cards also come equipped with one of or more fans. So when you are buying a video adapter, it will always come with a card. Always come with a card. Okay, so let's look at the last, which is the water cooling system. All right, this water cooling system, you find it on servers. All right, so computers with extremely fast CPUs and GPUs might use a water cooling system. Now, this is a metal plate, okay, placed over the processor, and water is pumped over the top to collect the heat that the processor generates. The water is pumped to a radiator to disperse the heat into the air, and the water is then recirculated. So a CPU fan make noise. You hear the fan making noise and can be annoying at high speeds. An alternative to cooling a CPU with a fan is a method that uses heat pipes. The heat pipe contains liquid that is permanently sealed at the factory and uses a system of cyclic evaporation, and all these ones you find them in most of the servers you see always come with this technology, and it's very expensive. Okay, so you find it mostly on servers, this water cooling system. So we still have more to do. So let's go through this now, and we only have 3 questions, and we're starting from group C. We're starting from group C.